Now, from the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center in Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Evening. Welcome to The World Over Live. We're so glad you decided to join us. Coming up, we'll talk about the historic papacy of the late Pope John Paul II with Newt Callista Gingrich, and they'll be talking about their new film, 9 Days That Changed the World. It follows the Pope's 1979 visit to his native Poland, which sparked a revolution of conscience that resulted in the eventual collapse of communism. We'll also talk about Newt Gingrich's recent conversion to Catholicism. And later, Austin Ruse, director of the Catholic Family and Human Rights Institute, is here to discuss the latest news from the UN. If you have a question, drop us an email at worldover@EWTN.com. Now let's get down to business. Here's the brief news from the world over this week. Immigration is once again front and center in the news after Arizona enacted the toughest immigration enforcement law in the country. The new law requires immigrants to carry legal residency documents and enables state and local law enforcement to question and arrest suspected illegal immigrants. In the wake of increased border violence, drug trafficking, and the recent murder of an American rancher along the Arizona-Mexico border, Arizonans overwhelmingly support the law. All three of Arizona's Catholic bishops, however, are opposed. Cardinal Roger Mahoney of Los Angeles offered the sharpest rebuke on his blog last week, calling it retrogressive, mean-spirited, and useless. He compared it to German, Nazi, and Russian communist techniques whereby people are required to turn one another into authorities on any suspicion of documentation. There is actually no such requirement in the law. The new law takes effect in July. And the clerical sex abuse crisis has another European bishop on the hot seat this week, this time in Rome. Bishop Gino Reali of Porto Santa Rufina admitted in court documents obtained by the Associated Press that he was told of sexual abuse allegations against a diocesan priest 2 years prior to the priest being arrested. Father Ruggero Conti is on trial this week in Rome, accused of the sexual abuse of 7 teenage boys. Father Conti was arrested June of 2008, just prior to a planned trip with parish young people to World Youth Day in Sydney. Bishop Reali and his diocese have refused comment. And in an exclusive interview on PBS NewsHour, Cardinal William Levada, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, acknowledged the mistakes of the Church in the handling of abusive priests and said he wouldn't be surprised if there were more bishops' resignations. He also criticized media coverage of the scandal and defended Pope Benedict.
I don't want to scapegoat anybody or have a conspiracy theory, but I do think that the American media in particular the question has been driven by information given by the plaintiff's attorneys who are looking for ways to involve the Pope somehow in a court process or something like that, which are, I think, bound to be futile, but nevertheless, I think that has driven a fair amount of the media coverage, if I may say so.
And Britain's Foreign Office has apologized to Pope Benedict after an internal memo mocking the Holy Father turned up in media reports. The memo, which was part of a planning discussion for the Pope's upcoming UK visit, suggested that the ideal visit would include Pope Benedict, quote, launching a line of condoms, opening an abortion ward, blessing a civil partnership, and reversing policy on women bishops and female ordination. The staffer who wrote the memo has not been fired. And the global push for the so-called reproductive health of women hit a couple of snags this week. Canada's representative to the G8's development group, Bev Oda, confirmed that the Canadian government opposes any maternal health initiatives that included the funding or promotion of abortion or abortion access. Britain's Foreign Minister, David Miliband, and U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton have both recently said that abortion was an important part of the G8 development push, to protect women's health around the world. And a spokesman for the leading British journal Lancet said they were pressured, delaying this week's release of a study showing a worldwide drop in maternal deaths. Why? Well, the release of the Lancet study coincides with the UN's kickoff of a new global initiative on reproductive, maternal, and newborn health. More about the global push in our upcoming segment. And the U.S. Bishops' troubled anti-poverty program lost the support of 2 more dioceses this week. LifeSite News reports that Pennsylvania Bishop Joseph Adamek of Altoona, Johnstown, and Bishop Kevin Rhodes of Harrisburg decided last fall to withdraw diocesan support of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development after an investigation showed that the CCHD gave financial support to several community organizations, some that supported abortion rights, gay marriage, and other activities that go against church teaching. Spokesman for both dioceses said the annual Thanksgiving week CCHD collection will instead be given to other anti-poverty charity efforts. And Pope Benedict's battle against Western secularization might soon be entering a new phase. Citing authoritative sources, veteran Vatican reporter Andrea Tornielli said this week that Pope Benedict will soon announce the creation of the Pontifical Council for the New Evangelization. The office will have the express purpose of re-evangelizing the West, in contrast to the Holy See's Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, which is responsible for the missionary work where the gospel is relatively new. Tornielli reports that the office will focus on countries where the gospel has been announced centuries ago and where its presence in the people's daily life seems to be lost. Europe and the United States and Latin America would be the areas of influence of this new structure. And the new English language translation of the Roman Missal has been officially approved by the Vatican. 8 years in the making, the revised translation of the prayers of the Mass is scheduled to be released sometime in 2011, or rather put into use. On Wednesday, the Holy Father said he welcomed the news that the new English Missal will soon be in use. The translation, which closer approximates the original Latin, is seen by most as more reverent than the current translation. For more on the Roman Missal, you can go to the bishop's website, usccb.org/Roman Missal, all one word. And finally, if true, it's a discovery of biblical proportions, literally. Explorers in Turkey claim to have found the remnants of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat. Here's what's known for sure. A wooden structure with several compartments was found some 13,000 feet atop Mount Ararat, and carbon dating puts the age of the structure at about 4,800 years, which approximates the biblical timeline for the Great Flood. The explorers have ruled out the possibility that the wooden structure was some sort of ancient mountaintop dwelling, as it sits 2,000 feet higher than any previously discovered settlement. Mind you, this isn't the first purported discovery of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat. Previous discoveries were claimed in 2006, 1993, and 1986, as well as during the Jesus movement in the early 1970s. A member of the research team said, "It's not 100% that it's Noah's Ark, but we think it's 99.9%. We'll see." When we return, Newt Callista Gingrich on their latest film, which centers on the late Pope John Paul II, and Newt Gingrich talks about his conversion to the Catholic faith. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. My first guest is a veteran politician here in Washington, D.C. He was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Georgia in 1978 and soon rose to prominence as a congressman, eventually becoming Speaker of the House in 1995. Since his retirement, or departure rather, from the House in 1999, he's done anything but fade into the background. Newt Gingrich is kept busy as a political commentator, a consultant, as well as a film producer with his wife and partner, Callista. They joined me in studio recently to talk about their latest project, 9 Days That Changed the World, a film about Pope John Paul II's 1979 visit to Poland that dramatically transformed the political landscape of the 20th century. Newt also spoke at length about his conversion to Catholicism last year. Here's the interview. So I want to start with the film, 9 Days That Changed the World. It's this incredible, wide-ranging documentary that looks not only at the life of John Paul II, but focuses on that 9-day visit to his homeland in 1979 that really did change the world. What was the motivation here?
In 2008, we went to Europe to tape a documentary on President Ronald Reagan. And at that time, we visited with President Lech Wałęsa in Gdansk and President Václav Havel in Prague. And we'd asked about the Holy Father and his influence on undermining communism. And both of them agreed that his trip in 1979 was critical to liberating Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. You know, as I watched this documentary, I was struck by the speeches themselves. When John Paul is out there in the squares and when he's driving with the Pope Mobile through the crowds, I've never seen footage where you could actually hear him. I've always seen the wide shots and the expansive things. How did you come across the footage, and how long did that take?
Well, it took us a good while because it turned out that the bishops had really given out cameras. They didn't trust the communists. And so the bishops got a bunch of cameras, and they had lots of people filming. And it turned out that all of this archive was available. It's actually now in the post-communist era at Polish national television. And our field producer, Vince Haley, went over and spent weeks with the archivist.
You can tell.
Just going through, mile after mile of film, finding these nuggets that have never been seen before in this kind of setting.
No, I'd never seen it, and as I was telling you before we started, the reactions of the people and the shots of the solidarity banners, I thought, clearly this was not authorized by the regime at the time, right. So how did they get this footage? So I'm glad you explained that. Now, you, Newt, have said that there is a correlation between what happened then and what was going on in 1979 in Poland and our contemporary situation here in the United States. How are they related?
Well, I remind people first that the Pope was dealing with an anti-religious government, would not allow children to pray in school, kept taking down crosses, a number of things you might identify in the current courts and in the current American elite. It's also clear from the film, and one of the most important parts of the film, is the number of Poles who said, when we all came together, for example, 3 million people in Victory Square in Warsaw, and we looked around, we suddenly realized there are more of us than there are of the government. And I think if the American people would understand Pope John Paul II's message, be not afraid, that if you are prepared to shelter under the cross, if you allow Christ to protect you, there's nothing the government can do to you. And so you don't have to be afraid. And then stand up for religious liberty, because as the Pope says so clearly, without religious liberty, you cannot find yourself, and therefore you have no real freedoms.
Yeah, that message of human dignity so shines through, that we have that inherent dignity, and it isn't bestowed by the government. It comes from God, and that's really that was the constant message he was pounding in as he made his travels here. Now, Callista, you are Polish, your background. Yes. How did that influence your affiliation with this project and desire to be a part of this?
I've always admired the Holy Father, John Paul II. My father's family comes from Poland, just outside of Krakow. So I grew up as a Polish Catholic, and we practiced the traditions, the Polish traditions, and we've always been active in our church. And through this, I've come to know and love Pope John Paul II. And for me, this was a very personal project.
Yeah. Now, did someone come to you all with this project, or did this come from you all?
Well, I think Vince Haley had the idea for a decade, and we had a great working relationship with David Bossie and Citizens United, and with Kevin Knobloch, who's our director. And so after we had done the Reagan film, I think when we saw the interviews on tape or on film, and we realized what Havel and what Wałęsa had said, and how much it fit into what Haley had told us they'd say. Right. And then we read Weigel's The Final Revolution, the book about the church in Eastern Europe. I think Callista and I just came to the conclusion that this was our destiny, that we had we had to do this.
Now, tell me about that moment. My producer was saying you told him, or he came across some information where you all were in Rome, and that sort of cemented the idea for you that you had to do this film.
Well,
Was that during that visit?
there's a very funny moment where we have an opportunity to interview a priest who's very, very close to the Pope. And I can't identify much more than that for right now, but he is in the film. And we went with trepidation to see him. And we got there about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'd walked our way through a variety of Vatican rooms with Swiss guards, and it was a little bit like a movie scene. And he was standing in the doorway, and it really had been built up to us as a very formidable guy. And he was standing in the doorway smiling, and he said, you know, a friend just came by with some Slovenian wine. And why don't we sit down and chat for a little bit? It's 5 o'clock. We could, and you could tell for that moment, and Vince was with us, and the four of us sat there. And an hour and a half later, I just kind of felt like this was our destiny. We had to do this film. He so vividly explained why Pope John Paul II made such a huge difference in the world that you felt like you wanted to share that with as many people as you could.
And is that your intention here? To share this? Is there a deeper intention for this film? What do you want people to come away and say?
Yeah, we really want to share the inspiring story of John Paul II and his very important message of freedom through faith. And that comes through in this story of human liberation.
And this has been a central theme for you all in your last few projects. I mean, you have the Rediscovering God in America project.
Yes.
You've got, you had the book, and there are two DVDs,
Two DVDs
correct?
on religious liberty in America.
So, I mean, this seems a recent passion of yours.
It was really inspired by the Ninth Circuit Court when they made the ruling about 7 years ago that saying one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance was unconstitutional. And for me, that was as big a moment as for Lincoln the Dred Scott decision, because I decided that if we were really going to allow the elites to destroy American core values, and remember, and Callista and I collaborated on this book and on all three of the movies, but our Declaration of Independence says we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now that either has meaning, in which case you and Callista and I are all three sovereign. Our power comes from God to us. It is inalienable according to the Declaration of Independence. And therefore we loan power to the government. The government doesn't loan power to us. Now either that's true, and what I was struck with, partly by reading George Weigel, and then the more we learned about the Pope, because he'd lived under the Nazis and he'd lived under the Soviets, Pope John Paul II understood and said with enormous clarity, you cannot be a complete person unless you can approach Christ. That your religious sense is the highest human sense. And therefore, a state which blocks you from the religious part of your personality is a state which has deprived you of your most fundamental human right.
That's right. And Pope John Paul II really reminded the Polish people of their rich cultural heritage, and he recommitted them to the Catholic Church. And in doing so, he gave them the courage to stand up to the Soviet dictatorship.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And when you watch this, it reminds you again not only of his great intellectual strength, but the vibrancy of his person and the charisma he had. And even 5 years, it's only been 5 years since he left the papacy, but it seems like a lifetime. And seeing it again for me was very not only nostalgic, but it really drove home the importance of this man, the historical importance. Did it change your perception of him? Because you had met him as speaker.
Yeah,
working on
but
this
in all
project.
fairness, it was very brief. I mean, I don't have the kind of experience you've had, and I certainly don't have the kind of experience George Weigel's had.
Oh, yeah.
I think what comes through, and you see this as much in the Nazi and Soviet periods as you do in the period when he's Pope. This is a person of such deep faith that he is fully prepared to die to be who he is. Now, it starts, when he helps form the Rhapsodic Theater under the Nazis, which had a death penalty.
Right.
Then he becomes a student priest under the Nazis, which had a death penalty. Then he takes on the Soviets routinely, regularly, every day. And you realize, and yet he wasn't combative. He wasn't hostile. He was a very cheerful representative of his faith.
We all remember that Stalin famously asked at some point during the Second World War, how many divisions has the Pope? Well, he got his answer in June '79, more than Stalin could imagine. Many more divisions than Stalin could imagine.
Perhaps at no time in the 20th century had one man so influenced a nation. It sparked a great movement of human liberation throughout Eastern Europe.
A revolution of conscience that confronted the lies of Marxism and Leninism. It led to the freedom of millions.
Many contributed to the defeat of Soviet communism, but it was Pope John Paul II who arguably had the greatest impact.
John Paul II, in a singular way, embodied the human triumphs, tragedies, adventures of the second half of the 20th century, as no one else did.
A man who stood for peace, a man who preached against war, a man who preached for individual freedom.
And his message was not just to the Poles, but to the other people repressed by the communist, atheist regime, that you too should have hope, and you too should have the strength of your faith, and you too have possibilities to become free.
When we come back, we're going to talk about Newt's conversion and Callista's influence on him, I think for the better. And we'll talk more about the film, 9 Days That Changed the World. The World of Our Life continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. We're joined once again by Newt and Callista Gingrich. They are the executive producers of the new film, 9 Days That Changed the World. It focuses on John Paul II's incredible influence on his homeland in Poland and what happened subsequently, really turned history. And an incredible man, and you all are incredible people. Thanks for being with us. I want to talk about your conversion, Newt, which many people didn't see coming. It sort of appeared one day in the New York Times. Now, our cameramen at EWTN had been watching you trek into the Basilica not far from where we're shooting, because your lovely wife is a member of the choir there.
Yes.
Now, I'd read that wherever you traveled, before Newt converted, you would take him to Mass with you.
Yes, we've been married since 2000, and although I do sing at the Basilica, occasionally we do travel. So whenever we're on the road, I'd always make sure that there was a Mass that we could go to. And so Newt has been going to church with me for many years.
Mm-hmm. And what influence did that have on the conversion? Was it a slow, progressive thing?
Well, let me say, first of all, we have heard Amazing Grace in Chinese. We've heard it in Hausa in South Africa. Wow. Callista's very, very faithful, and that was certainly an impact just by being with her all the time. I think what happened was that the process of going to the Basilica every Sunday, experiencing the Mass, and the Basilica is such a beautiful place, and the music is so beautiful, and everybody there, Monsignor Rossi and everybody there does such a wonderful job. And there were two real break points. The first was the choir went to Rome to make a CD in honor of Pope John Paul II. Really? Towards the very end of his life. I guess in March, he was already at the hospital. And they sang outside his room at the hospital. And it was the first time I can remember where I actually just had time off. I went as a spouse. And so they were recording at Centro Maggiore, and they could only record at night after the tourists left. Oh, wow. And so we'd get up in the morning, we were on a pilgrimage, and we would go to Mass, and we'd go to some interesting place, have a really nice Italian lunch, and then they would go off to record, and I was free. And I can't remember the last time that I had an entire week like this. And Monsignor Rossi was occasionally free, and he was sort of our leader and chaperone. And so we would sit and talk, and we talked about Weigel's cube in the cathedral, and we talked about the secular threat in Europe and the whole process of where Christianity was. And that really began my fundamental thinking at a historic level about the crisis of our civilization, the degree to which it relates directly to Christianity, and that you can't really explain the West without Christianity.
Right.
And so over the following several years, we kept talking about it and thinking about it. And then when Pope Benedict came to America, the choir was invited to sing when the Pope and the bishops had Vespers at the Basilica in the Crypt Church. And again, I was allowed as a spouse to show up. And seeing Pope Benedict come into the Basilica and seeing him, from 10 or 15 feet away, but seeing the joy in his eyes and the fact that he had chosen Christ our hope as the core of what he was trying to say to America. That night we were invited by Monsignor Rossi, who had quite a day, to come to dinner, and I said to him, I want to be received into the church. And we chatted briefly, and I said, I want you and Callista to be my sponsors, and I want you to take me through the catechism. And so we spent about 8 months going through the catechism together, and it was a very, very meaningful moment. And I came to the Basilica on a Sunday afternoon with 2,500 other people just before Easter, and Archbishop Worrell was very gracious, and it was really quite impressive.
Were there any hesitations? I mean, you were a Southern Baptist. You know the prejudices people hold toward the Catholic Church.
My background was very complicated. My grandmother actually originally raised me as a Missouri Synod Lutheran. I actually sang when I was very, very, unlike Callista, I quit. She actually sings, I don't sing. But when I was very, very young, I sang in the Lutheran choir. Then my dad was in the Army, and so I was an acolyte for whatever Protestant chaplain. So I've been a Presbyterian acolyte, I've been with Methodist. And then ultimately, once we moved to Georgia, and I became a Baptist. But my background is primarily one of deep belief in God. My grandmother really successfully drilled into me that there is a heaven and a hell, that if you're clever, you'll pick heaven. And that she would be glad to communicate to me in vivid ways what hell would be like if I didn't get it. And so I think I came out of that with a yearning. And the two things, I guess, that were the most powerful for me were, I have a sense of being at peace. I understand when you give the sign of peace and when the priest says, peace be with you, in a way I never did 10 or 15 years ago. I have a deep personal sense of what that means. And I find that the Eucharist is so fulfilling. I mean, for 9 years I watched Callista go and
you couldn't, you
have
didn't.
the Eucharist and have communion, and I didn't. And I knew what it meant to her. Obviously, I'd had communion in a Protestant setting, but there are some significant underlying differences theologically. And I really find every Sunday that it is enormously meaningful to be allowed to participate in the body and blood of Christ, and to actually experience the infusion and the full sense of the Eucharist.
Callista, have you noticed a change since the conversion in Newt?
Sure. I think you have a sense of peace that you didn't have a year ago.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It's really been a great joy to be able to share in the sacraments together.
Yeah. And how long have you been at the choir, singing in the choir here at the Basilica?
Yes, I joined in October of 1996.
Wow, so you've been there a long time.
I'm one of the more senior people in the choir now.
Well, you
We
don't
like
look
to
it.
think we like to think that she was the first Brownie member of the
That's
choir.
right.
It's now enough years we don't particularly.
That's right. That's right. No need to recount all of that. Now, there are people, Newt, in this political town, people have opined in some of the blogs and elsewhere that this was a political decision on your part. How do you respond to that? That the conversion was somehow political?
I think that is, people that cynical can't be answered. I mean, there's nothing I can say to them about it.
Yeah.
What we did, and I think the hours that I spent with Monsignor Rossi The conversation we still spend. I mean, the reading I am doing, and I did do.
Ellen, all those Sundays with your wife and the Mass. I mean, this wasn't a quickie.
Yeah.
This wasn't a quickie conversion.
I would just say, after 10 years of going to Mass everywhere in the world, this was hardly one of those shallow political gimmicks. I mean, we have spent a lot of hours, and obviously, given her schedule at the Basilica, we spend at Easter and at Christmas very long periods where the Basilica is at the center of our life. And I was doing that, frankly, as a supportive husband, and it sort of caught up with me in a way that I could never quite have imagined.
And being a historian, I'm sure that had some influence when you see the history of the Church and when you can see it and touch it in places like Rome.
Yeah, I mean, I do think from that standpoint that as somebody who loves history and thinks about history and writes books about history, the depth of a 2,000-year institution. When we're at St. Peter's and we went down into the Scavi and you're standing there, and Callista and I had this wonderful experience of, standing where technically people are reasonably certain St. Peter is buried.
Yeah.
And you look at that and you think, there is a connectivity that crosses 2,000 years to the man who personally was with Christ.
Yeah.
Now, part of it, and I think it's part of what makes Christianity interesting, is that Christianity is either a historic religion or it has no meaning. And as a historian, I find it comforting to relax and say this is an act of faith, but it's an act of faith about which we know an amazing amount.
Yeah, no, it's true, and it brings it all home. That Scavi tour, there's nothing like that Scavi tour. For anybody who hasn't taken it, you should go. I want to talk about some contemporary issues, if I might.
Sure.
You were the architect of the contract with America that really brought about 1994, right? That brought the whole Republican Revolution. Conservatism swept the halls of Congress. There is now something called the Contract from America, coming from the Tea Party movement. You were one of the signatories of this contract. Why did you sign on, and how is it like or different from what you devised in 1994?
Well, we first of all, I was in Austin, Texas, and met with about 500 Tea Partiers. They had done a great job. They had thousands of recommendations from all over the country. They had over 430,000 people had signed on. And it's a good statement of general intent. It's a statement of constitutional government, of smaller government, of less spending, of eliminating deficits by controlling spending, of cutting taxes to create jobs. I mean, when you read it, it's pretty solid, classical, smaller government, Jeffersonian conservative stuff. And I wanted to sign it to be part of what I think is an important national movement that says government's too big, it's too out of control. You can't have $10 trillion of debt to dump on your children and grandchildren. It's fundamentally immoral. We used to be a country where we paid off the mortgage and gave our kids the farm. We're becoming a country where we sell the farm and give our kids the mortgage. It's literally, I think, immoral in any sense of the word. So that's why I did it. But it's a very different document. These are different times. In 1994, no Republican House majority had won since 1954. So it had been 40 years. We were in a position where we actually, with Dick Armey's leadership, we actually wrote the bills. So when we said, here's a contract, I mean, everything was there. We're in a very different period. I think people are so fed up with insider, closed door, ram it through kind of politics that you really have to say, here's a process we're going to undertake. Here's a direction we're going to go, but we're going to do it out in the open. We're going to do it on C-SPAN and on the internet. We're going to do it in a bipartisan way. And I think people really want that experience of getting back to self-government as much as the specific actions.
What is your gut on the health care bill? This is symptomatic of what you just described.
It'll be repealed.
You think it will be repealed?
Look, I don't...
An entitlement program of this magnitude?
Look, well, first of all, you're not entitled to much. It's a very expensive program. It's like saying we're going to entitle you to have your car wrecked every Thursday. I mean, you'd say, well, maybe not. Could I get out of the entitlement? I'm an old-fashioned idealist. I really believe in America, and I really believe in the American people. And I don't believe some insider machine can ram through bad legislation and expect the American people to tolerate it. And I think that's why you see polls that say 58% of the country wants to repeal it, and about 38% wants to keep it. I can't remember in my lifetime a major reform that had that level of opposition, and I think it's growing. At the Center for Health Transformation, which I helped found, we're about to publish a chart that anybody can get if they want it, that has the 159 new offices in the bill. And this chart is the size of a wall. I mean, you look at it, you think government was already gigantic, and now they're adding 159 new offices. And we're not hot. I mean, the chart's just accurate. It's not pro or con. It just says, here's what's in the bill.
Here's what's in the bill. Yeah. No, it's staggering when you step back and look.
Well, the other side, from a Catholic perspective, to have a bill which I think, because the president's executive order was a joke and won't stand up in court, to have a bill which in effect furthers abortion, to have a bill which does not have a conscience clause for Catholic doctors and Catholic nurses and Catholic hospitals, but also for Orthodox Jews, for Latter-day Saints, for fundamentalist Protestants. You know, there are a lot of people, the vast majority of people who aren't in the elite, who believe deeply that religious conscience should be at the center of freedom. And this idea that we now have a secular state which can impose on us and make us do things that are against our religious beliefs is fundamentally the opposite of America.
And you saw in the New York Times this past week the president hastening this advisory board. He wants to get it up and running. That will no doubt become the rationing board we heard so much about during the campaign.
It said, I don't know if it was in the Senate version, but in the House version, on pages 25 and 26, it gave the Secretary of Health and Human Services the power to ration for all high-risk patients. It says so. They can establish waiting lists.
Right.
Well, waiting list is a form of rationing.
It is, no, it's staggering. How has, Callista, how has Newt's political eyes, if you will, changed since this conversion? Has there been a change in the way he approaches these issues?
I want to see where she goes with this.
You know, I think Newt has espoused very consistent political philosophy since he first became a member of Congress. And, you know, I think he is a very sensitive person, and I think perhaps in the last year has become more sensitive and perhaps even more emotional in the past year. But his political philosophy has been pretty consistent. If you look at speeches he gave in the 80s and the 90s, and you look at what he's saying today, he is a consistent person.
Yeah. Well, okay, what's your take on it?
Well, I think what she said was right. I think it goes back to what I said earlier about being at peace. Monsignor Rossi was a big part of this, and he and Archbishop Worrell have both done such a wonderful job of making us feel that, as people say to me occasionally, welcome home. And I think I understand why, as we say in the movie, the Pope holds on to the cross. The last scene we ever see of him is holding on to the cross from behind. And I think that part of what has happened for me that is different is that I feel I can shelter within the church and within the body of Christ in a way that I had never known before. And I think Callista's right. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think it does make me more emotional and more vulnerable because I don't have to be self-protecting because I have Christ and I have the church, and therefore I am protected.
Oh, fascinating. The movie is 9 Days That Changed the World. I hope everybody gets a chance to see it. Now, you are premiering it in various cities, but it's available on DVD, correct?
Yes, and if people would like to learn more about the movie, they can go to 9daysthatchangedtheworld.com.
Fantastic. Callista and Newt Gingrich, thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
For more information about 9 Days That Changed the World, including screenings and how to order DVD copies of the film, visit 9daysthatchangedtheworld.com. When we return, Austin Ruse of the Catholic Family and Human Rights Institute joins us to talk about what's happening at the UN. You won't believe it. Stay where you are. The World Over Live continues in a moment.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. My next guest has been keeping an eye on the goings-on at the United Nations for over 10 years. He's the president of the Catholic Family and Human Rights Institute. To discuss the latest news from the UN, please join me in welcoming Austin Ruse. Austin, great to have you back on the program.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Now, let's start with this UN Commission on Population and Development. Once again, that term that we've been hearing for decades now, reproductive rights, reared its head again.
Yes.
What does this mean? And I thought this wasn't going to be part of this discussion in this document.
I believe that there hasn't been a major or minor UN document for 20 years that hasn't mentioned reproductive health or reproductive rights. It is the major theme of so many countless UN negotiations. And so in this one, we actually thought we got to the end of a week-long negotiation on a Thursday night. It went until 5 a.m. It was a fairly decent document. And by 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, it was loaded to the brim with reproductive health and reproductive rights.
And how did this happen?
There was a closed-door meeting among some of the European countries and the chairman, and they just did it. One of the things about the United Nations, it is profoundly anti-democratic, is they do not listen to the member states sitting in the room. The member states sitting in the room ask for one thing, then they have a closed-door meeting and they get an entirely different thing, and the member states don't really have that much to say about it. It is profoundly anti-democratic.
Let's talk about what this means, though. When you have sexual and reproductive rights, that language, that lingo inserted into a document, as well as sexual education for young people, what does that mean? What does it require of the member states?
The key thing to understand is reproductive health and reproductive rights has never been defined by the UN General Assembly as including abortion. But the term is taken by UN committees and UN agencies and NGOs, and they say, don't you know that reproductive health means abortion? And so they go to countries around the world and they say there's a new international norm on reproductive health and abortion, and you have to change your laws. That's the importance of this language coming into UN documents, even non-binding documents like this outcome document of the Commission on Population and Development. And it is a little time bomb.
And that's the big question. What effect does this have on international law and nation-state law? I mean, it obviously is having an effect, and as you're seeing, we have new Supreme Court fight coming up. No doubt some of those being considered look to the international realm and these UN documents as the gold standard.
Amnesty International, for instance, which used to be a fairly well-respected human rights organization, now is pro-abortion, and they make the case that there's now a new international right to abortion based on outcomes like the Commission on the Status of Women, the Commission on Population and Development, and other things. So this is, and is it having an effect? As a matter of fact, yes. 2 years ago, the High Court of Columbia changed their laws on abortion, and they cited precisely these types of documents. It is a dead certainty that when Roe v. Wade is eventually reheard by the Supreme Court, that these types of documents will be mentioned.
And invoked as a counterweight to whatever consideration is happening.
If Roe v. Wade is overturned, it will be mentioned by the minority in dissent. If Roe v. Wade is upheld, it will be mentioned by the majority in upholding Roe v. Wade.
Now, the Center for Reproductive Rights, which is this pro-abortion group, they are suggesting that abortion is a human right and government funding is needed.
That's right. Not just needed, but government funding is now a human right, is now an international right.
Now, this is consistent, though, with what our Secretary of State has said.
Well, I regret to say that Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration now say that abortion is a part of reproductive health and reproductive rights, and that there's an international right to abortion. They are playing all off of exactly the same songbook. Absolutely.
And what are they using to justify this novel idea that the taking of an unborn child of the life of an unborn child is somehow now a human right?
From non-binding UN documents, like the outcome document of the Commission on the Population.
So they're interpreting the documents of the bureaucrats sitting in New York or in Brussels or somewhere else, and using that becomes the justification for proclaiming it a human right.
Because the phrase reproductive health is only mentioned in a single binding treaty, which is the Treaty on Disabilities. It's not mentioned. Reproductive health is not mentioned in any other binding treaty. So it's only mentioned in non-binding resolutions. So they're basing this whole fairy castle on comments of committees and non-binding documents.
Now, the interesting thing is the Center for Reproductive Rights and other groups are now saying the U.S. is in violation of this international norm because they aren't funding abortions enough.
That's right. That's right. Well, there is no end to the craziness once you allow UN committees to determine what international human rights are.
But I don't understand what their gripe is now, in that you have an administration that has certainly moved decidedly down the path of funding abortions abroad, and the bishops of the U.S. would argue have even enshrined it within the health care plan here in the U.S.
If a government has abortion against the law, they say international law requires them to change their laws. If it is legal, they say international law requires for them to pay for it. So there literally is no end to what they want of the abortion license.
And do you see this all as being one piece? I mean, we see the International Planned Parenthood Federation now coming out with a year-long push to justify and make the case that abortion is a human right. What's the end game here? They want international and national funding?
They want abortion to be legal through all 9 months of pregnancy and beyond, likely, and funded by governments across the entire globe. Now, most of the world either regulates abortion or makes it completely against the law. Even Europe, what we consider sometimes in social policy to be crazy Europe, has tighter abortion laws than we do. If we had Europe's abortion laws tomorrow, we would consider it to be a victory. So what they want is they want America's abortion laws all over the world.
Now, there was a new study, a British study that came out looking at maternal mortality rates. And it seems they're down, according to this British study. Why is this worrisome to abortion rights advocates?
Well, the number that has been traditionally used these last 15 years is by International Planned Parenthood Federation and UN agencies is that 500,000 plus women die every year from pregnancy-related causes. Their answer to that almost exclusively is abortion. That women absolutely need abortion so that they will not die during pregnancy. So the number that they have used all these years is 500,000. We have been saying for years that this is a phony number. The UN Population Division, which is the official UN statisticians, won't use the 500,000 number because they say that it's not substantiated. Why? Because in many parts of the world, they don't register sex at death, cause of death, let alone sex at death. So it's unknown. It's an unknown number. This new number from which was determined by the University of Washington and published in the medical journal Lancet, says that the number is 342,000, and they have better modeling. It's highly complicated, but it's much lower than they thought. They say the 500,000 number is phony, and this is a better number.
And the argument starts to fall apart when you look at countries like the U.S., Norway, Canada, with very liberal abortion laws, yet they have the highest maternal mortality rates.
3 of the countries who had increases in maternal mortality over the last many years are these 3 countries who have the most liberal abortion laws in the world. And the countries with the lowest maternal mortality numbers in the world happen to be countries where abortion is against the law: Ireland and Poland.
Interesting. I want to pivot for a moment. During this UN Commission on the Status of Women, I suppose at the negotiation itself, the Girl Scouts, amazingly, weren't handing out Thin Mints, but were handing out, apparently, sex guides. What happened there? What is this?
You know, it pains you to talk about how a good institution has been captured by the left and gone bad. At the Commission on the Status of Women, the Girl Scouts of America had a panel. We know a woman who tried to get into this panel, and she was kicked out. Arizona Mother of the Year, Sharon Slater. Well, Arizona Mother of the Year Sharon Slater waited by the door until it was over, and then when it was over, walked right back in as they were coming out and discovered a stack of International Planned Parenthood Federation sex guides, sex brochures on the literature table called Hot, Healthy, and Happy. And we can't talk about what's in that brochure. Now, the Girl Scouts have denied that they put it there, had anything to do with it. We looked into it, and we looked at who had the room before them. The NAACP had a panel on climate change.
So, yeah, it was not quite the hot and happy.
A Catholic aid agency from Europe had a conference on women and counterterrorism. So we believe that based on their prior relationship with Planned Parenthood, based on similar brochures being given out in other conferences, that they in fact allowed this to be handed out, and it's a crying shame.
So you think there's a relationship between the Girl Scouts and International Planned Parenthood?
Kathy Cloninger, who's the president of the Girl Scouts USA, said on the Today Show in 2004 that they have a relationship with Planned Parenthood.
Huh, interesting. So check your tag-alongs, right? Check what's tagging along with the Girl Scouts.
Wonderful cookies, but they come with a heavy price.
Yeah, I'll say. Let's talk about Pope Benedict. There's this UN judge, Geoffrey Robertson, who came out, this high-ranking UN judge, claiming that it is time to round Pope Benedict up and drag him before the criminal court.
Yes.
The International Criminal Court. Your
Yes.
thoughts on how realistic this is, or is this just a kind of secularist fantasy?
It is kind of delicious that he said this, because it shows how crazy some of these characters can be. So he has done us all a big favor. But it also shows you the mindset. Social conservatives at the time of the formation of the International Criminal Court complained and criticized and opposed the ICC precisely on these grounds. That, yes, they say they only want to go after the worst among us, the Hitlers, but we said, you know, they're going to go after religious leaders. And so this feeds into that criticism now.
Because everything will be interpreted as a hate crime.
That's right.
And this will be interpreted as a hate crime.
That's right. And the position of the Catholic Church on certain issues will be a crime against humanity. And so the behavior of the Pope could be considered a crime against humanity because he's covered up all the sex abuse and orchestrated all these bad things.
You don't think they'll waive their diplomatic immunity? I mean, is anyone at the UN taking this seriously?
Well, he's at the UN. Look, he has sovereign immunity as a head of state. This has been ginned up as a way, the real purpose of this is to take away the moral authority of the church in a very key institution, which is the United Nations and elsewhere. There was a conference in London 2 years ago called Women Deliver. They're gathering again in Washington in June.
Oh, I'll be there.
You might want to attend.
Yeah.
But there was a panel there about how to undermine religious opposition to women's rights, and one of the panelists gave a presentation on using the priest sex abuse scandal as a way to undermine the authority of the church. And it's the same people doing this right now.
Should the Pope be concerned about his visit to Britain?
No.
No.
No,
Okay.
I don't think so.
We'll leave it there. Then I'll keep my travel plans as planned. Thank you, Austin.
Thanks
Great
for
to see
having
you. See you here. For more information on CFAM, you can visit their website at c-fam.org. c-fam.org. With Mother's Day coming up next weekend, the prayers and personal devotions of Mother Angelica is a terrific gift, and it's available at bookstores everywhere. Don't you want the best-selling Catholic book in America? Of course you do. That is all the time we have now. For updates and the occasional commentary, you can follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/Raymond Arroyo, or on the fan page at Facebook. I can't even find the fan page, but maybe you can. We post exclusive pictures there, show previews, and much more. So join us. As always, I'm Raymond Arroyo. See you next time. Bye now.